Whenever I design a garden, I like to mix both annuals and perennials together. The annuals are great because they flower for such a long period. And even though we have to purchase them every year, they're well worth it for the color they give us throughout the season. Now, perennials, on the other hand, don't bloom for as long as the annuals do, but they give us a lot of interest with their different bloom times throughout the year. And we don't have to purchase them every year. They come back each year in the garden. Well, there's sort of a myth out there that once you plant a perennial, you don't have to do anything to it. Well, that's not exactly true. If you've gardened with perennials before, you'll know that in the springtime, we need to come out and cut back all of the growth from the previous year. Right here is a clump of Amsonia, or blue star, one of our native perennials from the eastern part of the state. And you can see that we've cut back all of that growth from last year to make way for the fresh new growth of the new season. Well, cutting back the perennials is one thing that we do to maintain our perennials. The other thing that perennials need to have done to them occasionally is dividing. And to divide perennials, there are 3 reasons why you would want to do that. And the first reason is to control the size of the plant. Right here we've got a Fire Witch dianthus, and this was planted a number of years ago. I think we actually planted about 3 plants in this spot, but you can see that the plant has spread. You can see that they're growing over here, and we've got some variegated monkey grass, and they're actually starting to get a little bit crowded. Whenever the leaves come out on this monkey grass here, they will actually shade this out a little bit and probably kill this part of the plant. So if we come in here and dig this up, dig the clump, divide it a little bit, we can definitely control the size, get it back to where it needs to be. So controlling the plants is the first reason we divide. Number 2, when it comes to dividing perennials, we do this to rejuvenate the plants, to get more vigor. And if you look right here in the center of this dianthus here, you can see that we've got some browning and just these older parts of the plants that have been growing here in the same spot for several years. They're just starting to lack vigor a little bit. They're really crowding each other out. They're not blooming as much. So if we divide this clump, maybe put some compost in that area, put some of the newer, more vigorous growth from the outside of the plant into the center part, it'll bloom a lot better and it'll just be a lot healthier. So that's the second reason we divide our perennials, to rejuvenate them. The third reason we divide perennials is to get new plants. We can divide up those perennials, have a lot more plants to put in different places in the garden, maybe create new gardens, or we can just pot some up and share those with our friends and our neighbors. The time of year a perennial flowers tells us the time of year that it needs to be divided. If a perennial blooms in the springtime, we want to divide it in the opposite season, so the fall. So our spring flowering perennials need to be divided in the fall. Anything that blooms in the fall, like our asters and goldenrods, we divide those perennials in the springtime. One spring flowering perennial we've got down here in our rock garden is the Georgia blue veronica. And you can see the flowers haven't completely opened up because it's a little bit cloudy today, but very attractive in the springtime, just covered with these little blue flowers. And since it blooms in early spring, we want to divide it in the fall. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, what about a summer blooming perennial? Do we divide that in the wintertime? Well, that's not necessarily the case. Any perennial that blooms in the summertime, we want to divide it in either the spring or the fall. So you kind of have your choice there. Now, I want to share one bit of information with you. Any perennial can be divided in the springtime if it's a perennial that needs to be divided. Up here we've got another spring flowering perennial. This is a little native senecio, or squaw weed or ragwort. It flowers in the springtime. We could divide this in the spring if we wanted to. So perennials that bloom in the spring can also be divided in the springtime, the very season they flower. But be aware, if you do that in the springtime, the plants will not flower probably until the next year. So if you need to divide a clump, or you need to move a perennial that blooms in the spring, you can do that in the springtime, but just be aware that it probably will not flower until the next year. In keeping with the thought of dividing perennials opposite the season they bloom, we've got a patch of goldenrod right down here, a perennial that flowers in the fall, beautiful yellow flowers, and we're going to divide this clump. Now, before you divide your perennials, if the soil is not moist, if we haven't had some rain in a while, you want to come out a few days beforehand and thoroughly wet the area. That way the plants can be fully hydrated and better able to withstand having their roots and their stems cut apart. Well, today is also a really great day to divide perennials because it's overcast and it'll keep these plants from drying out as much. Well, one of the first things I'm going to do here is cut back this plant. You can see that this is a goldenrod that doesn't get too tall in the garden. It's a fairly short one here, less than 2 feet tall. One of my favorites, called golden fleece. It's a goldenrod that doesn't run rampant all over the garden as well. But before we divide this plant, I'm going to make sure that I got all those tops cut off. I'll do that anyway, whether we're dividing a plant or not, to make it look better in the springtime. And the next thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to dig up this clump here, kind of clean away some of these leaves, and I'm going to pull back a little bit of the mulch here so I can get down to the soil. But I'm going to take the shovel and I'm going to come out a few inches from the foliage there and just dig down maybe 5 or 6 inches, and we'll just do this around the portion of the plant that we're wanting to divide. We've got a good organically amended soil out here. We've added compost to our butterfly garden over the years, and we've got a good rich soil for these plants. It makes it a lot easier to work our shovel into. But again, we couldn't ask for a better day to be doing this with the clouds that we got here. If you have to be working on a sunny day to divide your perennials, you can maybe make sure that you periodically wet the plants, or when you're digging them up and dividing them, to put them in a shaded area, maybe with a little bit of a shade cloth or something like that. Now I'm just going to kind of lift this clump out of the ground here, and you can see it's held together really well with all those roots. Clean off some of the leaves. I'm just going to bring it over here, and now we're ready to divide the clump. But good healthy clump of goldenrod we got here. Now, some perennials are so tough that one of the easiest way to divide them is to just take your shovel and just kind of slice through the clump. That's perfectly acceptable, but a lot of gardeners prefer to try another method, and that's just take 2 garden forks or potato forks, like they're sometimes called, and just put those sort of back to back, kind of work those into the clump like so, and then just kind of pry the clump apart like so, and that way you don't tear as many roots and stems, and they come apart pretty easy. You can see we've got a lot of moisture in the soil here, and they come apart really well. Now, if you're having a lot of problems, if you've got a really tight soil, you can take a water hose and kind of wet this down a little bit if you want. And I'm betting this is so loose we can almost tear it apart with our hands. Yeah, there we go. But look at all the little baby plants we'll have from this large clump of goldenrod. But again, you can see these roots are now exposed, and we're really glad we got this cloudy weather. But if you're doing this on a sunny day, we'd want to keep these wet a little bit with our jug of water here and keep them in the shade. Now, we could take this and replant it in the spot. We've got a really rich soil here, but we're just going to make sure it stays that way by adding some compost to the place where we just dug up our perennial. Now, this is especially important if you're dividing a perennial that's been in place for several years and the soil has become depleted of all of those nutrients. I want to make sure we get some good new soil in place to help revitalize, reinvigorate the perennial that we're dividing. But whenever we plant the plant in place, we'll want to put it at the same level that it was growing. And again, I've taken a piece from the outer edge of the clump of the perennial, and it's a nice, healthy, vigorous part of the plant. And this is a good way to rejuvenate and to control the size of your perennials. Now that's if we're going to plant them back in the spot where we took them out. Now some of these other pieces of the goldenrod that we have here, we're going to move to other places in the garden. And since we don't have a place ready to put those in the ground, we're going to pot them up for now. And I've got some pots here. And another thing, we're not going to use the same soil that we dug out of the ground. You don't want to use garden soil in your pots because that would be too heavy. We're not just going to take the soil from the ground and pot up our new pieces into these pots. We've got some potting soil right back here. This is sort of a nursery mix. I'm going to just wet it a little bit here. It's a little bit dry. Just kind of work that in. Got a lot of sand and some peat moss and some pine bark. Just going to put some of this into a pot here. And we're going to take some of these pieces. This one's a little old. You can see some of those old stems that don't quite have the vigor of some of the younger pieces. But I think this one will be okay. We'll just actually break that off there. And now we've got a good piece with lots of young, vigorous shoots there. We'll pot this up. And again, when we put the pieces of the plant in the little container here, we want to try to get it about the same level as it was growing in the ground. And again, we want to use potting soil. Don't use the soil out of the garden. It's just going to be too heavy. And if you leave that in the pot too long, the roots could suffocate. So there's our little golden fleece, goldenrod, little plantlet. We can pot up several of these and keep them for several weeks before we locate a new home for them in our garden or one of our friends' gardens. Now, it isn't necessary to divide our perennials every year. Some need to be divided a little bit more often than others, and some perennials you really don't want to divide at all. And some of those are things like Russian sage, the baptisias or false indigos, the columbines, the balloon flowers, orange butterfly weed, Missouri evening primrose, and the hellebore. And some of these plants just really resent being divided, so we really don't need to dig those up and split those apart. The hellebores, if they've been in the garden for a number of years and they are established, they really resent being dug up and divided or even moved. Like this clump right here, it's been here about 7 or 8 years and it's growing great. It's blooming well, it's nice and healthy, it's growing great, and there's no way we need to dig this up and mess with the roots or dividing the Christmas rose at all. So remember, the 3 reasons to divide perennials is to control their size, to rejuvenate the plants, and to get more plants.